I still remember the sound. It wasn't the crash of concrete or the roar of an excavator. It was the silence that hit me right after I pulled into my driveway and realized something that had been standing there for nearly 10 years had simply vanished. My backyard was wide open. Strangers were walking across my property like they owned it, and a concrete pump truck was pouring a foundation where my block wall used to be. That's the day my homeowners association decided to steal part of my land. What they didn't know was that I'd spent almost 3 decades making a living, catching people who thought they were smarter than building codes, survey records, and the law. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 52 years old, and until recently I worked as a senior county building inspector outside Prescott, Arizona. Most people think my job was walking around construction sites telling contractors where they messed up. Sometimes it was, but the real work was paperwork, permits, surveys, legal descriptions, signatures, tiny details that most people ignored until those details cost somebody a fortune. I've always believed buildings don't fail because of concrete. They fail because people get greedy. Looking back now, I probably should have realized greed had been growing inside our neighborhood long before anyone touched my property. When my wife and I bought our corner lot back in 2014, Juniper Hills was quiet. Kids rode bikes without worrying about traffic. Neighbors borrowed ladders instead of lawyers. And the HOA mostly cared about trimming bushes and organizing 4th of July picnics. Then the elections happened. Every community has that one person who mistakes authority for ownership. Ours was Victor Langford. Victor owned several luxury RV dealerships across northern Arizona. He wore custom-tailored golf shirts, drove a black Rolls-Royce Cullinan everywhere, and somehow managed to mention money within 5 minutes of every conversation. His favorite sentence was, "People need leadership because they don't know what's good for them." He smiled when he said it, but it never felt like a joke. A few months after becoming HOA president, he started talking about building a brand new clubhouse. According to him, Juniper Hills deserved something prestigious: a fitness center, event hall, wine tasting room, conference space. The presentation looked more like a country club than a neighborhood amenity. Most residents loved it. Property values, they said, better reputation, more community events. I didn't care one way or another as long as it stayed on HOA land and followed county regulations. That's probably why Victor never liked me. Every board meeting I'd quietly ask one question: has the county approved the updated plans yet? He'd flash that polished salesman smile and say, "Danny, you always worry too much." I'd answer, "It's literally my job." People laughed. Victor never did. Around that time, he began dropping little comments whenever he saw me outside. "That wall of yours sure takes up a lot of space." Or, communities sometimes need small sacrifices for the greater good. I figured he was fishing for a voluntary easement. He never asked directly, and I never offered. The wall he kept staring at wasn't decorative. I'd spent nearly $20,000 building it after we moved in because our lot sat on a busy corner. 8-foot concrete block, engineered footing, steel reinforcement, inspected 3 separate times, every permit properly filed. It wasn't just a fence. It gave us privacy, security, and peace. My wife loved drinking coffee on the patio because she couldn't see passing traffic. Our golden retriever treated that backyard like his kingdom. That wall represented years of saving and planning. Then came the Thursday that changed everything. I had spent the morning inspecting a commercial remodel about 40 minutes away. Around 3 in the afternoon, I turned onto my street and immediately noticed construction equipment where there shouldn't have been any. At first, I assumed someone nearby was replacing a driveway. Then I saw dust floating over my roofline. I parked, stepped out of my truck, and honestly thought I'd taken a wrong turn. My wall was gone, completely gone. Huge chunks of broken concrete lay scattered across my lawn while workers guided wet cement into wooden forms extending several feet inside what had always been my property line. A massive banner hung from temporary fencing. Future Juniper Hills Community Lodge. Grand opening spring next year. I walked straight toward the nearest foreman. "Excuse me," I said as calmly as I could. "You're standing in my backyard." He looked at a clipboard, then pointed toward orange survey stakes. "No, sir. According to the plans, this section belongs to the HOA now." I actually laughed because I thought he had to be joking. "No," I replied. "According to 30 years of county records, you're about 8 feet onto Lot 21. And unless Arizona moved property lines while I was at work today, somebody has made a very expensive mistake." He shrugged, almost apologetically. "I'm just building what's on the survey. That sentence stuck in my head the entire walk back to my truck because contractors don't invent surveys. Someone had handed him documents. Someone wanted him to believe those papers were illegitimate. And deep down, before I even opened a single county file, before I checked a single permit, before I made a single phone call, I already knew this wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. It was organized. And if my instincts were right, Victor Langford had just crossed a line that couldn't be erased with an apology. If you'd like to see how I uncovered what was really hiding behind those construction plans, I didn't call the sheriff that afternoon, and I didn't start yelling at the construction crew either. People always assume that's what happened because that's what they would have done. But after 28 years in county inspections, I learned one lesson that never failed me. Angry people make noise. Patient people collect evidence. So I drove straight to my office instead of home. My wife, Melissa, called while I was on the highway. She had already seen pictures from a neighbor who texted her asking if we'd sold part of our yard. She sounded shaken. "Danny, please tell me they didn't actually tear down the wall." I looked through the windshield for a few seconds before answering. "They did." There was silence. Then she quietly asked, "What do we do?" I smiled even though she couldn't see me. "We let them keep building for one more day?" She knew me well enough not to ask why. By the time I reached the county records department, I already had a checklist in my head. Original subdivision plat, parcel history, survey archive, easement records, building permits, every document connected to Juniper Hills over the last 15 years. One advantage of spending your career in local government is knowing exactly where paper trails begin and exactly where they fall apart. The original subdivision map confirmed what I already knew. My property line hadn't moved an inch since the neighborhood was created. Lot 21 ended exactly where my demolished wall had stood. The clubhouse foundation, according to satellite measurements, extended nearly 8 feet into my property. That alone would have stopped construction. But then I opened the survey attached to the HOA's building permit application. My stomach tightened. Someone had submitted a revised boundary survey showing the HOA parcel extending directly across my lot. At first glance, it looked convincing. Professional stamps, survey notes, bearings, measurements. But after less than 30 seconds, I spotted the first problem. The benchmark elevation referenced a monument that had been removed by the county almost 6 years earlier. Whoever forged the survey had copied information from an old file without realizing that monument no longer legally existed. It was the kind of mistake only another survey professional or building inspector would notice. I leaned back in my chair and whispered to myself, "Got you." Then I found something even worse. Attached behind the survey was a recorded easement agreement supposedly signed by me almost 8 months earlier. My signature sat neatly above a notary seal. It looked close enough that most people would accept it. The only problem was, it wasn't my signature. Whoever forged it copied the shape but missed the rhythm. That's probably a strange way to describe handwriting. But after signing inspection reports almost every day for 30 years, you recognize your own hand the same way you recognize your child's voice. Mine always tilted slightly upward at the end. This one dropped sharply downward. Even funnier, the document claimed I'd signed it on a Tuesday morning. I laughed out loud because I knew exactly where I'd been that Tuesday morning. I was in Flagstaff teaching a county code seminar to nearly 80 inspectors. There were attendance records, photographs, even a recorded presentation with a timestamp. I physically couldn't have been signing paperwork in Prescott. At that point, this wasn't a property dispute anymore. Somebody had committed felony forgery. Most people would have stopped there. Most people would have been satisfied proving ownership and rebuilding the wall. But something kept bothering me. Nobody risks prison over 8 feet of dirt. 8 feet wasn't the prize. It was part of something bigger. So instead of closing the file, I opened another one. I requested the HOA's financial disclosures that every member had access to, but almost nobody actually read. Thousands of pages, budgets, vendor invoices, landscaping contracts, insurance renewals, reserve studies, board approvals. Most homeowners throw those packets away unopened. I spent the next 6 hours reading every line. Around midnight, I noticed a name that appeared over and over again. Desert Crest Development. They were billing nearly $3 million to build the clubhouse. I knew commercial construction costs well enough to estimate projects by eye. Based on the plans I'd seen, that building should have cost somewhere around $1 million. Maybe a little more if they chose premium finishes. $3 million made no sense. Curious, I searched the corporation records. Desert Crest Development wasn't owned by an experienced contractor. It belonged to Victor's brother-in-law. Interesting, I kept digging. The landscaping maintenance company servicing the neighborhood belonged to Victor's cousin. The security company belonged to an old college roommate. Property management consulting? Another longtime business associate. It was like pulling one loose thread from a sweater. Everything started unraveling. Melissa brought me dinner around 9 that night. She walked into my office carrying takeout, looked at the mountain of paperwork covering my desk, and asked, "Please tell me this isn't just about the wall anymore." I turned the monitor toward her. "Look at this." She stared for several minutes before finally saying, "Danny, are they stealing from everyone?" I nodded. "I think they've been doing it for years." The next morning, I requested banking records that had been disclosed during annual HOA audits. Several payments flowed through consulting firms registered in Nevada with no employees, no offices, and no actual business activity. Shell companies. Money entered one account, disappeared through another, then resurfaced in businesses connected to Victor's family. I couldn't prove every dollar was criminal yet, but I could prove enough to justify a much larger investigation. That's when I made my first official move. At 8:15 Friday morning, I drove back to the construction site wearing my county inspection jacket. The workers recognized me immediately. The foreman walked over looking nervous. "Morning." I handed him a bright red notice. "County stop work order. Effective immediately." He stared at the paper. "You're shutting down the entire project?" "Permit fraud, boundary discrepancies, possible forged property documents. Nobody pours another inch of concrete until this is resolved." Within 20 minutes, every machine stopped. Engines shut off one by one. Cement trucks turned around. Workers packed up their tools. Victor arrived about 45 minutes later in his Rolls-Royce, sunglasses on, smiling like he expected another casual conversation. That smile disappeared the second he saw the red tag hanging from the temporary fence. He stormed toward me. "You can't do this." I folded my arms. "Actually, I just did." He jabbed a finger toward my chest. "You're abusing your position because you're emotional." "No, Victor. I'm using my position because someone submitted forged legal documents to obtain a county permit." His face changed for the briefest moment. Just 1 second. But after interviewing dishonest contractors for decades, I knew exactly what I'd seen. Fear, real fear. Then the salesman returned. "This is all a misunderstanding." I shook my head. "Misunderstandings don't notarize fake signatures." He didn't answer. He simply got back into his SUV and drove away. That afternoon, I personally delivered copies of every document to the county attorney's office, along with a written summary detailing the forged survey, the false easement, the illegal encroachment, and the financial irregularities I'd uncovered. I expected the investigation to take months. Instead, my phone rang less than 48 hours later. An investigator introduced himself and said something I'll never forget. "Mr. Harper, we'd like you to come downtown. We think your wall may be the smallest crime we've found." Sitting inside that conference room, surrounded by detectives, financial investigators, and prosecutors, I realized this case had already grown far beyond my backyard. They slid several printed emails across the table, emails obtained through an emergency warrant that none of us had expected to move so quickly. I read the first line once, then read it again because I almost couldn't believe someone had been reckless enough to put it in writing. At that moment, I understood Victor hadn't simply underestimated me. He'd underestimated how dangerous the truth becomes once enough honest people start comparing notes. If you'd like to see how those emails destroyed an entire HOA leadership team and changed the neighborhood forever, the first email was only 2 sentences long, but it was enough to change everything. One board member had written, "Danny never checks that side of his property during the week. If we move fast, it'll already be built before he notices." Victor's reply was even shorter. "Handle the paperwork. I'll deal with him later." I looked up from the page, and one of the investigators just sighed. "We've been doing this a long time," he said. "And you'd be amazed how many people think deleting an email actually deletes an email." There were dozens more. Conversations about backdating documents. Discussions about finding someone flexible to notarize signatures. Messages complaining that I kept asking questions during HOA meetings because, according to Victor, people like Harper make everyone else's life harder. I almost laughed at that one because he wasn't entirely wrong. My entire career had been built around making life difficult for people who cut corners. The difference was, I never imagined I'd end up investigating my own neighborhood. The arrest happened the following Tuesday night during a regularly scheduled HOA board meeting. I wasn't there, but one of my neighbors recorded part of it on his phone from the parking lot. Victor was standing at the front of the room giving another speech about community progress when uniformed deputies walked through the doors. You could actually see the confidence drain out of his face. He tried smiling, tried shaking hands, even asked if there had been some kind of misunderstanding. The lead detective simply said, "Victor Langford, you're under arrest." The room went completely silent. A few people actually started clapping before realizing how awkward that probably looked. 3 other board members were taken into custody that same evening, while investigators served search warrants on several businesses connected to the HOA contracts. Over the next few months, the full picture finally came into focus. The clubhouse project had never really been about building a better neighborhood. It had become a vehicle for steering inflated contracts to friends and family while quietly expanding HOA-controlled land one property at a time whenever they thought homeowners wouldn't fight back. Mine just happened to be the property where the entire scheme fell apart. During the court proceedings, I spent nearly 6 hours on the witness stand, explaining permits, surveys, inspection procedures, and why the submitted documents couldn't possibly be legitimate. The defense attorney tried suggesting that perhaps I simply remembered my own signature incorrectly. I actually smiled before answering. "Counselor, I've signed thousands of official inspection reports over the last 28 years. If I can't recognize my own signature, I should probably return every professional license I've ever earned." Even the judge smiled at that. The forensic handwriting expert confirmed the signature had been forged. Digital analysts recovered deleted communications, and financial investigators traced money through multiple shell companies that existed only on paper. By the end of the trial, the evidence wasn't just overwhelming, it was embarrassing. Victor eventually accepted a plea agreement rather than risk losing at trial on every count. He was sentenced to several years in state prison. Several former board members received felony convictions of their own, and the HOA itself lost its corporate authority after regulators concluded the board had repeatedly violated both state law and its own governing documents. Construction stopped permanently. The unfinished community lodge sat abandoned for months before the property was seized and later sold to recover part of the financial losses. As for my backyard, the county ordered every inch of the illegal foundation removed. Watching those machines tear out the same concrete they had poured only weeks earlier felt strangely peaceful. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. The workers were just doing their jobs, the same way they'd been doing when they unknowingly built on my land. They weren't the villains. They had trusted paperwork that should never have existed. Several weeks later, a contractor rebuilt my wall almost exactly the way it had been before, except this time Melissa asked for a small stone bench along the inside corner facing the sunset. She told me, "If we're going to start over, let's build one thing we didn't have before." She was right. Sometimes rebuilding isn't about replacing what was lost. It's about refusing to let someone else's greed define how your story ends. Financially, the settlement covered the cost of the original wall, the damage to our property, legal expenses, and additional compensation for everything we've been forced to endure. But if I'm being honest, the money wasn't what stayed with me. What stayed with me was seeing neighbors who had barely spoken for years start talking again. People who once assumed the HOA board knew best began asking questions, reading budgets, attending meetings, and realizing that communities only work when ordinary people refuse to surrender responsibility to the loudest person in the room. Every now and then someone asks whether I regret pushing the case as far as I did. My answer is always the same. If they had apologized, admitted the mistake, and rebuilt the wall the day it happened, none of this would have followed. But the moment they forged documents, stole property, and believed nobody would challenge them, they stopped making mistakes and started making choices. Those choices carried consequences. Today, when I sit on that stone bench in the evening with Melissa beside me and our old golden retriever stretched across the patio, it's hard to believe how much one missing wall changed our lives. I don't think about revenge anymore. I think about accountability. Because revenge ends when someone loses, but accountability makes sure the next person doesn't have to go through the same thing. So, now I'd like to hear from you. If you discovered your HOA had secretly taken part of your property, would you have fought all the way to court like I did? Or would you have accepted a settlement and moved on? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because these stories always spark incredible discussions. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes no one is above the law. I'll see you in the next story.